Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and this is the beginner's guide to the standard yarn weight system. So this yarn weight system is standard in the US for labeling yarn, and the yarn weight system classifies yarns by their thickness. And I have a whole bunch of different yarns here from different categories, or what we call different yarn weights. They're weight categories. And the weight category basically tells you how thick a yarn is. So I also have some swatches down here for most of these. And my swatches are knitted garter stitch. Now, if you're a crocheter, it doesn't matter if you don't knit, because we're talking about the yarn and the thickness of the yarn, and the swatches are just to show you the difference in the size of the stitches. So if you're a crocheter, everything I'm going to talk about in this video still applies when you are shopping for yarn. So for example, a number 4 yarn may be classified in the number 4 category, but another number 4 yarn might actually be a little bit thicker, but still be classified as a number 4. So the yarns are placed into categories, and that doesn't guarantee that every number 4 yarn is going to be exactly the same thickness, because they're not. But it does help give a guideline for choosing a yarn that you can substitute in a pattern based on the weight category that it is classified into. So there are actually 8 categories in the yarn weight system. I only have 7 here, and the one that I don't have is the largest kind, which is a jumbo yarn, and that is mainly used for arm knitting or crochet that you do without a hook, because you just use your hands because it's just so humongous. But I don't have any of the largest category here, but I have them all lined up from thinnest to thickest. And let's start over here with this first one. So this is a lace weight yarn, and this is classified in the 0 category. And lace weight yarn is extremely thin. It is very lightweight, and this is designed to be used in lace knitting or lace crochet, where you're using a much larger hook or needle, and you want a very open, lacy fabric. So this is classified in the 0 lace weight category, and this is Knit Picks Gloss Lace. So on the label here, sometimes you get a label where that they show you the little number of the weight category of your yarn. So this one right here in my hand is a number 2 category. But this one, even though it does have a number on the category, which is a 0, this one's just marked lace weight. So that is something that you're going to run into, and this is why it's good to know what the names of the categories are called, and what types of yarn fall into those categories, because some labels do not give you the little symbol with the number in it. So this is a category 0, which is lace weight. This is very thin, as I mentioned, and size 10 crochet thread also falls into this 0 category. So I don't have a swatch for this here. I have swatches for all these other ones because these are actually 4 projects that I'm working on. But the lace weight yarn I do not have a swatch for, but this knits up a very light, lacy fabric. And the same would go if you were to crochet with it. So this yarn right here is a number 1 category. This is called number 1 Superfine. And the number 1 Superfine category is also sometimes called sock yarn or fingering weight yarn. And those both mostly fall into the number 1 Superfine category. Now this one is a very thin yarn as well, but not quite as thin as the lace weight yarn. So fingering yarn is often used for knitted socks, even crocheted socks. It is also used for anytime you want something that's very lightweight and drapey. Anytime you want a light, fluid fabric that lays very nicely, this is a good choice for that, because it is nice and thin and it creates a lightweight fabric. So this one right here is from Knit Crate. This is from my Knit Crate subscription. This particular yarn is limited edition and is no longer available, but it is a good example of a fingering weight yarn. And I do have a swatch in my garter stitch down here of this fingering weight yarn. And this, as I mentioned, is very pliable, very drapey, and it gives a very fine texture because it's such a thin yarn. And so you need smaller needles for the thinner yarns and bigger needles for the thicker yarns. And that's part of what makes the difference between the size of the stitches. But the thickness of the yarn also affects the size of your stitches as well. So that is the fingering weight or sock weight, but classified as number 1 super fine. The next category is number 2 fine. And this is often called sport weight. So you see this label, this is also from Knit Picks, but on this one it's called Brava Sport, so that you know it's sport weight, and it also has the number 2 label on the back. So this is the standard yarn weight labeling, where that you have this little picture of a ball of yarn with a number in the middle. So this is the number 2 fine, and the sport weight yarn is a bit thicker than the fingering, but not quite as thick as the next category, which you would expect it to be that way. So here is my garter stitch swatch of the sport weight yarn, and this one is a little bit thicker than the fingering. The stitches are a little bigger, but this one is also pretty lightweight and has some very nice drape to it. And I should mention that, of course, the drape of your fabric can also be affected by the fibers in your yarn. So the thickness alone is not what determines how drapey a fabric is, but in general, lighter weight fabrics tend to drape more than bulky fabrics. So the next category is number 3 light, and this one is also called DK or light worsted. Now this one is another Knit Picks yarn. This is Gloss DK, and we can see the little number 3 label right there that tells us what category it's in. And it also says up here that it is DK weight, and DK falls into that number 3 category. So as we would expect, of course, this swatch has some nice drape to it, but it is a little bit thicker with a little bit larger stitches than the sport weight yarn. And just in a way of example, if I were to use the same size needles I used for the sport weight yarn and use those needles with the DK, then it would create a denser fabric, because even though the needles are the same size, that thicker yarn will create a denser fabric with those small needles. So the next one in the lineup here is the number 4 medium. And number 4 medium weight yarn has several different names as well. Sometimes it's called worsted or Aran, or sometimes it's even called Afghan yarn. But generally it's called worsted or Aran. And then this one is my worsted weight swatch. And you can see the size of the stitches difference between this one and the DK. And this one is a Knit Crate yarn as well. This is the limited edition yarn. And this one in particular does not have the little number symbol on it. So again, it's good to know what category, what number category the label, the name on the label falls into. So worsted weight falls into the number 4 category. So next up is the bulky weight, and this is called number 5 bulky. And this type of yarn is also called chunky yarn, craft yarn, or rug yarn. And it is definitely thicker than the worsted weight. Quite a bit thicker, but not quite double of the thickness of the worsted weight yarn. So this is Knit Picks Brava Bulky. And here we have the little number symbol with the 5 that shows us that it is in the 5 category. And it also says bulky weight. So, of course, this swatch has much bigger stitches than the worsted. And finally, I have a swatch and a skein of the number 6 super bulky yarn. And this is one of the biggest yarns that you would knit with on needles most of the time. So this is Lion Brand Wool Ease Thick and Quick. And you can see this one has the number 6 super bulky label on it. So, of course, this swatch has some very large stitches. But there is actually one more category besides what I have here called number 7 Jumbo. And as I mentioned before, those yarns are generally made for either knitting with super humongous needles or crocheting with a super humongous hook, or else they're made for arm knitting or arm crochet, hand crochet, where there's no needle or hook involved. I don't have any of that particular yarn in my stash, so I don't have any on the table with me here, but that one is even thicker than the super bulky, and it will have a number 7 label, or else it will say Jumbo on the label. So another thing that you might notice when looking at a yarn label is that, yes, sometimes it has the number, sometimes it doesn't, but it should always tell you what weight the yarn is, as far as is it sport, DK, worsted, bulky, etc. And it will also give you a recommended needle size and a recommended gauge, whether you're doing it in knitting or crochet. So for this particular yarn, it recommends 5.5 stitches to 1 inch on number 5 or number 6 knitting needles, or 12 to 17 single crochet in 4 inches on a size 7 or size I crochet hook. Now these are just guidelines, and of course it's more important to match the gauge in the pattern that you're following than to match the gauge that is listed on the label. However, if you're just making up a project on the fly and you're not actually following a pattern, this can help get an idea of what size needle or hook to use with this yarn. Now there's a couple more points that I want to mention here. So in this particular yarn, I have 123 yards to 50 grams. So there are 123 yards in length in this particular skein, and there's 50 grams in weight in this same skein. So the ratio of how many yards to grams can help you when you're substituting a yarn. So for example, if a pattern calls for a specific yarn, and you don't have that particular yarn, but you want to use a different yarn than what's called for in the pattern, you can get another yarn that's in the same weight category. So for example, if I were going to knit something in DK weight yarn, and the pattern called for a yarn that I don't have, or a yarn that I can't buy, I don't have access to, then I would need to find another yarn that's DK weight number 3. And I would also, if I wanted to be really precise about how I substitute yarn, I could also look at the yards to grams ratio here and find another DK weight yarn with a similar yards to grams ratio to the yarn that's called for in the pattern. And that will help make sure that whatever DK weight yarn that I end up using is extremely similar in thickness. So let's say my pattern used a yarn that had 127 yards in 50 grams. So if that were the case, then this yarn with 123 yards and 50 grams would be a very similar thickness. But if it only had, say, 105 yards in 50 grams, then that yarn would be thicker than the yarn used in the pattern, even if it's still classified as DK weight. So as a general rule, when you're substituting yarn, you want to use a yarn that's in the same number category as the yarn called for in the pattern, but if you want to be even more specific and more precise, check that yards to grams ratio to make sure that the yarn you're using is very similar in thickness to the yarn called for. And if you'd like some more information on the standard yarn weight system, then there's a link in the description box to the Craft Yarn Council's Yarn Standards page, where they have a whole chart with a whole bunch of information on the different yarn weight categories, what types of needles, sizes you should use, and hook sizes, the recommended gauge for the different types of yarns, and a whole bunch more info on that. So be sure to go and check that out for more information. And one last thing I want to mention is that if you are in a different country, for example, if you're in Europe or if you're in Australia, a lot of times the yarn thickness systems, the way that they label yarn by thickness, is different from what we use in the US. So the standard yarn weight system is really only hard and fast rules in the US, and although they might also use them in Canada, I'm not sure if they do or not. But in Europe and in Australia, they use a different type of thickness system. So if you're in one of those locations and you're shopping for yarn there, you might want to look into the system that is used to label yarn by thickness in your country. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know what you think of the standard yarn weight system in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.